Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to look at some of my own genealogy. So what we're looking at here is the so-called slave plantation, or what us people in the community like to call an Indian prisoner of war camp. However, because we've been programmed to think of slavery in a certain way, come to find out the reality is an entirely different thing. So we'll scroll up. This is at the end of the documents, but we'll scroll up. Right here is a little sketching of that house where it says dwelling. It says there's a dairy right there on the side. Right there, you can see it over that way. They have a barn, a smokehouse, a cemetery, which may or may not have headstones with names on them. But they have a box garden in the back, an office on the side, and then an orchard and garden to the side as well. Now, this is where my third great grandfather lived. This place is called Mount Prospect. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. You scroll down in the information, it says it has a small family graveyard, including the grave of EXUM Lewis. It gives the dates of the dude's birth and death. Now, that guy was one of the white people, or so-called slave owners of this place, and one of my relatives was named after him, first and last name. So what I'll do right now is just go through and point out their peculiar instances within the information that let you know that the people there did not get there on boats and pretty much were not slaves. They might have been working for the man, but they didn't live in that house with him. And 2 days ago, went and looked online at an aerial view of where this house was at and the land around it, and it's all flat. However, the guy, EXUM Lewis, he bought up land around there supposedly and then called it Mount Prospect. Anytime you call something a mount, pretty much there's some high ground around. But since it's very flat around there, I can only presume that that was an Indian mound or some mounds around there. But it goes on to say that in the early 19th century, Lewis advertised brandy for sale, probably distilled from the products of this orchard. Later information will lead us to presume that that whiskey that they were distilling there was being distilled by Indians. The dwelling itself consists of two-story main block, which is the house, which rests on a cellar of brick laid in English bond, is covered with apparently original weatherboards with a molded edge of unusually complex profile. Now, remember, the Indians built castles and very elaborate structures, and they dealt with bricks. They made bricks. So it says this one had molded edge of unusually complex profile. That tells me that Indians built that. It says each end of the facet is defined by fluted corner posts, which carry a heavy molded cornice that returns slightly into the gable ends. Beneath the cornice is a course of unusual sewn bracket-like modillions. Goes on to say that the south end has steep paved shoulders and is of an irregular combination of Flemish and common bond. It says there is a heavy molded cornice in this room, which does not recur in the others. The arrangement of the front entrance and the entry to the stair is unusual. It says at the time of his father's death in 1796, EXUM Lewis Jr. was 25 years old. He later married Anne Harrison of Virginia and became the father of 8 children. And you go down here and it says that in the 1830 census credits him with the ownership of 42 slaves. So basically this man and his 8 children supposedly owned 42 slaves. It goes on to talk about the property and how after the dad died, they all split it up. Said the store they had was supposed to go to the younger brother when he turned 20, but he moved to Baldwin County, Alabama in 1803 and to have died there in 1819. Now, I also have genealogy from the Baldwin County, Alabama area. So this kind of tells a story. His father was a Revolutionary War veteran from Virginia who moved down to North Carolina and basically bought some Indians and some land, or possibly bought some land that was next to their homes. And then later on in the documents, they were basically put down as his slaves when really they just did all the work and he paid them and they worked out their deals or whatever. That's the way it's looking, because when I looked up the bios of a lot of my relatives that came from this so-called plantation right here, a lot of them were skilled individuals. And it's because I know all that background information is the reason why I would say that they built the house, they made the brandy, and they smoked that meat, because one of my relatives was a calf skinner. It says right here, in the midst of his other responsibilities, Lewis served as postmaster at Mount Prospect from 1819 to at least as late as 1831. He was also active in the manufacture and sale of brandy, the breeding of horses, and the sale of real estate. The census of 1820 reveals that Lewis's immediate household consisted of 14 persons. The 1830 census credits him with the ownership of 42 slaves. It goes on to talk about how they split up the land and sold the land up after he died going into the 1900s. Some of my relatives left here and went to Texas. Some of them stayed there. And the reason why they stayed because it was always where they have always been. So it says after Lewis's death in August of 1839. His executors advertised for sale about 2,000 acres. This tract has considerable cleared land on it and several settlements with dwelling houses. Now that revealed that there was more than the big so-called plantation house that we seen at the bottom of this document. But it goes on to say that Lewis's will provided his wife Anne with a life interest in the land and plantation whereon I now live, with the balance of my property to be equally divided between the whole of my children. That was in 1839. So that was during the time that slavery was definitely still going on. So it says nothing about the 42 slaves that were just recorded on the census 9 years earlier in 1830. So that kind of leads me to believe that they never were slaves and they had their own dwelling houses and settlements, because it says several settlements with dwelling houses that don't exist there anymore. When I looked recently, none of those dwelling houses exist nowhere in the area. The old church still stands there. That's it. But you never know. I could have not looked as wide of range as I needed to view it. But all of this tells me one thing. Now, this is in Edgecombe County, North Carolina. When you go look up the information online, it says that it was formed in 1741 and that historically the county is home to the Tuscarora Indians. Says despite the Tuscarora's mass exodus from the region in the 18th century, descendants of the Tuscarora still inhabit Edgecombe County. Now, right here, it gives you a little option to click for a link to the Tuscarora War. When I went and did that, it gives you about 8 or 9 different counties and says they were a terrifying place to live from 1711 to 1713. Says the North Carolinians and the Yamasee waged war against the Tuscarora. But it was the Southern Tuscarora who was in the war. As we go look right here on the Indian massacres list, in 1711, you had the massacre at Bath in North Carolina. It says the Southern Tuscarora, Paul Pleco, Kotheshnis, Kores, Matamuskeets, and Machaponagos attacked settlers at several locations in and around the city of Bath, North Carolina. Hundreds of settlers were killed and many more driven off. Then in 1712, massacre at Fort Narhantes, North Carolina. It says the North Carolina militia and their Indian allies attacked the Southern Tuscarora at Fort Narhantes on the banks of the Nueces River. More than 300 Tuscarora were killed and 100 were sold into slavery. Edgecombe County is in northeast North Carolina, so they're not the Southern Tuscaroras, which would indicate that they were still in their land when the old man Lewis came down from Virginia after the Revolutionary War in the 1780s. Or 1770s. That house was built in 1776. So I have strong reason to presume that my people right there in northeast North Carolina in the late 1700s and early 1800s, from the census records I have, were of the Tuscarora Indian tribe. But definitely nowhere in any of the documentation have I found that they came off a boat or had any kind of African culture, names, anything like that. The last thing I want to add to this video is the fact that my relatives there at that so-called plantation didn't show up on the census until 1830. In 1820, they didn't show up there. That's because inside of the 1820s, the Europeans decided to basically commit identity theft of millions of people. Right here in 1828, Noah Webster put in his dictionary that American is a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So back in the 1820s, the dictionary was almost like a set of laws or a rule book or something, so that when you went in it and you read the word and you read the definition of it, that's what it was. That's what's the say. That's what was said, so it is type thing. So right here in the dictionary, they was telling people that an American is a European or the descendants of Europeans. They had already given Indians the title of black, Negro, or colored. So, and it was odd that they had a son go down to Alabama and get killed right around the same time that Alabama became a state. So apparently he went down there trying to do the same thing his dad did in North Carolina, which was swindle some Indians out of their land. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?